Well, I think that the spot that we're really watching is Treasury Secretary.
Yeah.
And our reporting shows that Trump is going to meet with Kevin Warsh, who is a former Fed governor, tomorrow. He is also supposed to meet with Mark Rowan of Apollo. And then also Senator Bill Hagerty is also in the mix now at this point for Treasury Secretary. So Lutnick getting the Commerce Secretary, I mean, it's still a huge position, still has a ton of power in the federal government, but it is not sort of the plum job that he had wanted. And you have to remember that he is in charge of the personnel for the transition and had basically sort of put himself up for the Treasury Secretary, much to the surprise of Trump himself. And there was a ton of infighting over the position last week. We reported that, Howard Lutnick was really going for it and lobbying and asking allies to call Trump and make the case for him. Scott Bessent was doing the same. Trump became very irritated with this and basically now is widening the search and looking for, a third party to fill that job.
Sometimes it just feels like kids in a sandbox playing. Nancy, one thing that we were thinking about in our coverage of who ultimately gets nominated, who ultimately sits in the seat of U.S. Treasury Secretary. I mean, it's a big job. It's Bloomberg's bread and butter. I feel it's like, we're constantly talking about what the Treasury Secretary of the United States is up to. Remind us about this position, what this Treasury Secretary does, why it's so important domestically and globally.
Well, the Treasury Secretary just oversees a huge number of things. You have to remember that there are a number of tax cuts expiring in 2025. Obviously, that's something that a lot of Bloomberg readers care about. The Treasury Secretary will be intimately involved in that. Treasury is also in charge of, sanctions, which has been really important as the Middle East has been erupting. Also, it has a huge economic policy wing. It oversees the IRS, just so many key functions. And I think that the Trump team really wants someone in there who has some gravitas on Wall Street and is someone who, gets along with Trump, but who can also really, appease the markets and send a signal to the markets that this is a serious person, who can really represent the country and also Republicans.
How important is somebody who agrees with the Trump administration's views on tariffs? And the reason I ask is because it's not necessarily seen universally on Wall Street as a good thing. So the folks who say tariffs are a good thing and also have the Wall Street credibility, there might not be that many of them.
Well, I think that if we, if the tariffs was the #1 criteria for Treasury Secretary, then Bob Lighthizer would have gotten the job.
Fair.
He was certainly in the mix for it. I think Trump really does want someone who is seen as a little bit more Wall Street friendly. And you have to remember, in his first term, he had an economic policy team that did not universally agree on trade and the tariffs. I covered all 4 years of that, and there were a ton of fights that played out in the Oval Office between Secretary Mnuchin, who was then the Treasury Secretary, Peter Navarro, who worked on trade, Robert Lighthizer, who worked on trade. They did not all agree, and I think Trump actually liked that. He liked that discussion and sort of fighting happening in front of him. And so I don't expect his economic team to sort of share universal views, all across the board.
Hey, one last question, 30 seconds here. So if it turns out to be Kevin Warsh, how might that be perceived globally? Is this kind of a more typical or usual choice?
I think so. I mean, he worked in one of the Bush White Houses. He's been a Fed governor. I've been told by people who know him, he's very diplomatic. He gets along well with people. And so I think that for Wall Street, this would be seen as sort of a more conventional and safe choice.